Hello, in this video I'm going to give an introduction to the skeletal system and talk about bone tissue, including bone cells and bone matrix. So the skeletal system includes all the bones of the skeleton, which in a typical adult will be 206 bones. Believe it or not, some people have more bones than other people, so this number can differ from person to person. Also, we have more bones at birth than we do as an adult. This is because during the process of development, some bones fuse together. For example, the hip bone, which is also known as the os coxal bone, is actually made of 3 separate bones that fuse together. These 3 separate bones are the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, and they fuse together when you're a teenager. The skeletal system also includes all the cartilages, ligaments, and other connective tissues that stabilize or connect our bones. The skeletal system has multiple functions. One of the most obvious functions is support. The skeletal system does support our body and support our organs and cavities. But it is also important for storage. And we don't think of it often as that, but we do use our bones to store calcium, especially, but also to store fat. We have yellow bone marrow in some of our bones, and we store fat there. Like, we need extra ways to store fat, right? Our skeletal system also functions in hematopoiesis, which is the production of blood cells. So this is where the red bone marrow comes into play. Our red bone marrow produces our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets. The skeletal system also functions in protection, and this is pretty obvious when we think of things like our skull and our facial bones and our rib cage and sternum. Last but not least is leverage. When we think of the body moving, we don't always think about bones first. We usually think about muscles first. And it's true that our skeletal muscles do move our body. But without a leverage system, our skeletal muscles really couldn't do anything at all. Our muscles need something to pull on, and what they're pulling on are our bones. When we look at the different bones of the human body, we can put them into about 4 different categories. Short bones are typically cubed in shape. So they're roughly as long as they are wide. These include the carpal bones in the hand and the tarsal bones of the foot. And then we have long bones, which are definitely longer one way than another. These include most of the bones in our arms and our legs, like the ulna, radius, and femur in the picture here. And then we have flat bones. And this doesn't mean that they're perfectly flat, but they're relatively flat. Right? The scapula and the sternum are examples of flat bones. The os coxal bone, or hip bone that I mentioned, is also an example of a flat bone. And then last but not least, we have our junk drawer of bones, the irregular bone category. So this is any bone that's not short or long or flat. And it includes bones like the sphenoid bone of the skull and the vertebrae of our vertebral column. Now let's take a look at bone tissue. Right? Bone tissue is a connective tissue, and like most connective tissues, it has a lot of matrix and specialized cells. About 98% of our bone mass is actually matrix, so the matrix is really important for our bone tissue. But bone does contain living cells. That's about 2% of the bone mass. So first, let's take a look at the matrix. Matrix is composed of 2 things, a ground substance and protein fibers. The ground substance of bone matrix is actually the calcium and the phosphate. So the ground substance is the mineralized inorganic compounds like calcium and phosphate. Collectively, we refer to this as hydroxyapatite. The function of the ground substance of bone is to resist compression forces. Right? So if I had an accordion and I was trying to close the accordion, I would have to compress it to close it. So that's a compression force. So the calcium and phosphate are very good at resisting compression forces that your body places on your bones. Also in the matrix are going to be protein fibers. The protein fibers are collagen protein fibers. And the collagen protein fibers are very good at resisting tension forces. So if I had that same accordion and I tried to open it up, right, that would be a tension force there. And collagen is very good at resisting tension forces. The orientation of these calcium phosphate crystals in collagen protein fibers does matter in bone. Whenever you use a bone, you break it down and you rebuild it, putting these crystals in the collagen fibers in the best orientation possible to help resist the forces that you're placing on it. Next up are the bone cells. There are actually 4 types of bone cells. osteocytes, osteoprogenitor cells, osteoclasts, and osteoblasts. And each of these has a different role in our bone. The last three, the osteoprogenitor cells, the osteoclasts, and the osteoblasts, are found in the bone membranes. So membranes are sheet-like structures, and we have these sheet-like structures on the outside of our bone and on the inside of our bone. So the membrane on the outside of the bone is called the periosteum, and the membrane that lines the inside of our bone spaces is called the endosteum. And both of these have connective tissue to them, but they also contain these other bone cells too. Let's first take a look at the osteocytes. These are the most abundant of the bone cells. Osteocytes are considered to be mature bone cells, and it's their job to maintain bone matrix and repair bone. They're not found in the membranes of bones like the other bone cell types. They're found surrounded by matrix. So osteocytes are the only bone cell types that are going to be completely surrounded by calcium and phosphate and collagen. So because they're surrounded by this rock-like material, it's very, very hard for osteocytes to obtain nutrients. And so they have to rely on their neighboring cells to share nutrients and gases with them. And adjacent osteocytes are able to share their cytoplasm contents with each other via specialized extensions called canaliculi. So the canaliculi just allow neighboring osteocytes to share nutrients and things. Next up are the osteoprogenitor cells, also called osteogenic cells. And these are a type of stem cell. And these stem cells really only give rise to one other cell type, the osteoblasts. Osteoblasts eventually do mature into osteocytes. The osteoprogenitor cells are very active in fracture repair and also in bone building, which makes sense since they give rise to our osteoblasts, which help to build bone, and osteocytes, which help to repair and maintain bone tissue. The osteoprogenitor cells are found in the membranes of bone, in the endosteum and the periosteum. Osteoblasts are our bone building cells. Blast means to build, right? So these are immature bone building cells that produce our bone matrix. So these cells build the matrix, and they build the matrix all around them. And once the osteoblast is completely surrounded by matrix, we no longer call it an osteoblast, we call it an osteocyte. The osteoblasts are found in the membranes of bones. Last are the osteoclasts. The osteoclasts are our bone cells that break down bone. Clast means to break down. So these are actually strange cells. They're more closely related to our blood cells than they are to our other bone cells. And they're multinucleated, and they just look really, really weird. And they secrete acids and protein digesting enzymes that dissolve the collagen and release the calcium and phosphate from bone. And these osteoclasts are really important during bone growth and bone repair. And they're not nearly as numerous as the other bone cell types. But like the osteoblasts and osteoprogenitor cells, they are also found in the membranes of bone.